Hey everyone, welcome back to The Borrowers. We are finishing up this fantastic tale and going to see exactly what happens to our heroes. Now, just a couple reminders and a review of what we have read so far. So, it's been a while, but at the very beginning of the story, this is actually a story within a story. An older lady named Mrs. May is telling a young girl named Kate all about the borrowers. So, our borrowers are tiny little people who live in houses and borrow things from the big people. Our borrowers are named the Clocks, and they live under the large grandfather clock. Pod, Homily, and Ariete, their daughter. They have been borrowing in this house for years, and now there's only one family left there. Great Aunt Sophie is older and stays to her bed, and there are only two other humans that really walk around, the housekeeper and the gardener. Also, they now have a young boy who's been staying with them and is kind of the start of all the borrowers' trouble. Pod gets stuck on a curtain, and the boy finds him, sees him, and helps him down from it. We learn that it's not good to be seen because once a borrower was seen and they thought it was a rat infestation. So they called the exterminator and they got a cat, and that cat might have caught one of the girls. Not good. So they decide that Ariete should learn how to borrow properly. She goes out, and on her first time outside ever, she is seen as well by the boy. They actually talk a bit and make a deal. She will read books to him if he takes a letter to her aunt, uncle, and cousins who live a few fields away. Well, that happens, and Pod and Homily find out, and it is not good. They are upset. Also, because the boy now knows where they live. Well, in our last bit of chapter, the boy found out exactly where they live and lifted up the floorboards. But he was trying to be nice. What he did was he brought them furniture from the dollhouse in the schoolroom that was way up on a shelf that they could never have gotten to. So he helped fill their house with very fancy and wonderful things. Well, where it turned not good is he started going from the drawing room cupboard, full of very expensive and very nice things that the borrowers couldn't get to because the cupboard was closed and locked. Well, the boy could get to it, and they kept filling and filling up the house. The housekeeper, Mrs. Driver, found that all of those things were missing and wanted to figure out exactly who it was. So she stayed up late at night and found the gapped floorboard that the boy had just put back and opened it. She screamed, and Crumpfrel, the gardener, came running. They think it's a matter for the police because someone has been stealing things in there. She can't figure out quite if it's mice or if it's actual little people, but that's where we're at, and we are in big trouble. The borrowers cannot stay here any longer. They are in danger. Let's see exactly how our story ends up. Chapter 18. The boy lay, trembling a little, beneath the bedclothes. The screwdriver was under his mattress. He had heard the alarm clock. He had heard Mrs. Driver exclaim on the stairs, and he had to run. The candle on the table beside his bed still smelt a little, and the wax must still be warm. He lay there waiting, but they did not come upstairs. After hours, it seemed, he heard the hall clock strike 1. All seemed quiet below, and at last he slipped out of bed and crept along the passage to the head of the stairway. There he sat for a while, shivering a little, and gazed downwards into the darkened hall. There was no sound but the steady tick of the clock, and occasionally that shuffle or whisper, which might be wind, but which, as he knew, was the sound of the house itself, the sigh of the tired floors and the ache of the knotted wood. So quiet it was that at last He found courage to move and to tiptoe down the stairs and along the kitchen passage. He listened a while outside the baize door, and at length, very gently, he pushed it open. The kitchen was silent and filled with grayish darkness. He felt, as Mrs. Driver had done, along the shelf for the matches, and he struck a light. He saw the gaping hole in the floor and the objects piled beside it, and in the same flash, he saw a candle on the shelf. He lit it clumsily, with trembling hands. Yes, there they lay, the contents of the little home, higgledy-piggledy on the boards, and the tongs lay beside them. Mrs. Driver had carried away all she considered valuable and left the rubbish. The rubbish it looked thrown down like this: balls of wool, old potatoes, odd pieces of dolls' furniture, matchboxes, cotton spools, crumpled squares of blotting paper. He knelt down. The house itself was in shambles, partitions fallen, earth floors revealed where Pod had dug down to give greater height to the rooms, matchsticks, an odd cogwheel, onion skins, scattered little bottle tops. The boy stared, blinking his eyelids and tilting the candle so that the grease ran hot on his hand. Then he got up from his knees and, crossing the kitchen on tiptoe, he closed the scullery door. He came back to the hole and leaned down. He called softly, "Arrietty! Arrietty!" After a while, he called again. Something else fell hot on his hand. It was a tear from his eye. Angrily, he brushed it away, and leaning further into the hole, he called once more. "Pod!" he whispered. "Homily!" They appeared so quietly that at first, in the wavering light of the candle, he did not see them. Silent they stood, looking up at him with scared white faces from what had been the passage outside the storerooms. "Where have you been?" asked the boy. Pod cleared his throat. "Up the end of the passage, under the clock." "I've got to get you out," said the boy. "Where to?" asked Pod. "I don't know. What about the attic?" "That ain't no good," said Pod. "I heard them talking. They're going to get the police and a cat and the sanitary inspector and the rat catcher from the town hall and Line Buzzard." They were all silent. Little eyes stared at big eyes. "There won't be nowhere left in a house that's safe," Pod said at last, and no one moved. "What about the doll's house at the top shelf in the schoolroom?" suggested the boy. "Even a cat can't get up there." Homily gave a little moan of assent. "Yes," she said, "the doll's house." "No," said Pod in the same expressionless voice. "You can't live on a shelf. Maybe the cat can't get up, but no more can you get down. You're stuck. You've got to have water." "I'll bring you water," said the boy. "And there are beds and things there." He touched the pile of rubbish. "No," said Pod. "A shelf ain't no good. Besides, you'll be going soon, or so they say." "Oh, Pod," pleaded Homily in a husky whisper. "There's stairs in the doll's house and 2 bedrooms and a dining room and a kitchen and a bathroom," she said. "But it's up by the ceiling," Pod exclaimed wearily. "You got to eat, haven't you?" he asked. "And drink?" "Yes, Pod, I know, but—" "There ain't no buts," said Pod. He drew in a long breath. "We've got to immigrate." "Oh," moaned Homily softly, and Arrietty began to cry. "Now don't take on," said Pod in a tired voice. Arrietty covered her face with her hands, and her tears ran through her fingers. The boy, watching, saw them glisten in the candlelight. "I'm not taking on," she gasped. "I'm happy. I'm so happy." "You mean," said the boy to Pod, but one eye on Arrietty, "you'll go to the Badger set?" He too felt a mounting excitement. "Where else?" said Pod. "Oh, goodness gracious," moaned Homily, and sat down on the broken matchbox chest of drawers. "But you've got to go somewhere tonight," said the boy. "You've got to go somewhere before tomorrow morning." "Oh, my goodness gracious," moaned Homily again. "He's right about that," said Pod. "Can't cross them fields in the dark. Bad enough getting across them in the daylight." "I know," cried Arrietty. Her face wet glistened in the candlelight. It was alight and excited, and she raised her arms a little as though about to fly, and she swayed as she balanced on her toe tips. "Let's go to the doll house just for tonight and tomorrow." She closed her eyes against the brightness of the vision. Tomorrow the boy will take us, and she could not say where. Take us? Cried Homily in a strange, hollow voice. How? In his pockets, chanted Ariadne. Won't you? Again she swayed with lighted, upturned face. Yes, he said, and bring the luggage up afterwards, in a fish basket. Oh my goodness, moaned Homily. I'll pick all the furniture out of this pile here, most of it, they can't hardly notice, and anything else you want. Tea, murmured Homily, enough for our lifetimes. All right, said the boy, I'll get a pound of tea, and coffee too if you like, and cooking pots and matches. You'll be all right, he said. But what do they eat? Wailed Homily. Caterpillars. No, Homily, said Pod, don't be foolish. Luppy was always a good manager. But Luppy isn't there, said Homily. Berries? Do they eat berries? How do they cook out of doors? No, Homily, said Pod. We'll see all that when we get there. I couldn't light a fire with sticks, said Homily. Not in the wind. What if it rains? She asked. How do they cook in the rain? Now, Homily, began Pod. He was beginning to lose his patience, but Homily rushed on. Could you get us a couple of tins of sardines to take? She asked the boy. And some salt, and some candles and matches. Could you bring us the carpets from the doll's house? Yes, said the boy. I could, of course I could. Anything you want. All right, said Homily. She still looked wild, partially because some of her hair had rolled out of the curlers, but she seemed appeased. How are you going to get us upstairs, up to the schoolroom? The boy looked down at his pocketless nightshirt. I'll carry you, he said. How? Said Homily. In your hands? Yes. I'd rather die, said Homily. I'd rather stay right here and be eaten by the rat catcher from the town hall at light and buzzard. The boy looked around the kitchen. He seemed bewildered. Shall I carry you in the clothespin bag? He asked at last, seeing it hanging in its usual place on the handle of the scullery door. All right, said Homily. Take out the clothespins first. But she walked into it bravely enough when he laid it out on the floor. It was soft and floppy and made of woven raffia. When he picked it up, Homily shrieked and clung to Pod and Ariadne. Oh, she gasped as the bag swayed a little. Oh, I can't. Stop it. Put me out. Oh. And clutching and slipping, they fell into a tangle at the bottom. Be quiet, Homily, can't you? Exclaimed Pod angrily and held her tightly by the ankle. It was not easy to control her as he was lying on his back with his face pushed forward on his chest and one leg held upright by the side of the bag somewhere above his head. Ariadne climbed up away from them, clinging to the knots of the raffia, and looked out over the edge. Oh, I can't, cried Homily. Stop it, Pod, I'm dying. Tell him to put us down. Put us down, said Pod in his patient way, just for a moment. That's right, on the floor. And as once again the bag was placed beside the hole, they all ran out. Look here, the boy said unhappily to Homily. You've got to try. She'll try, all right, said Pod. Give her a breather and take it slower, if you can, what I mean. All right, said the boy, but there isn't much time. Come on, he said nervously. Hop in. Listen, cried Pod sharply, and froze. The boy, looking down, saw 3 upturned faces catching the light. Like pebbles, they looked still and stony against the darkness within the hole. And then, in a flash, they were gone. The boards were empty, and the hole was bare. He leaned into it. Pod! He called in a frantic whisper. Homily, come back! And then he too became frozen, stooped and rigid above the hole. The scullery door creaked open behind him. It was Mrs. Driver. She stood there silent, this time in her nightdress. Turning, the boy stared up at her. Hello, he said, uncertainly after a moment. She did not smile, but something lightened in her eyes, a malicious gleam, a look of triumph. She carried a candle, which shone upwards on her face, streaking it strangely in light and shadow. What are you doing down there? She asked. He stared at her, but did not speak. Answer me, she said. And what are you doing with the clothespin bag? He still stared at her, almost stupidly. The clothespin bag? He repeated, and looked down, though surprised to see it in his hand. Nothing, he said. Was it you who put the watch in the hole? No, he said, staring up at her again. It was there already. Ah, she said and smiled. So you knew it was in there? No, I mean yes. Do you know what you are? Asked Mrs. Driver, watching him closely. You're a sneaking, thieving, noxious little dribbling of no good. His face quivered. Why? He said. You know why. You're a wicked, black-hearted, fibbing little pickpocket, that's what you are. And so are they, the nasty little crafty, scampy, scurvy, squeaking little... No, they're not, he put in quickly. And you're in league with them. She came across to him, and taking him by the upper arm, she jerked him to his feet. You know what they do with thieves? She asked. No, he said. They lock them up. That's what you do with thieves, and that's what's going to happen to you. I'm not a thief, cried the boy, his lips trembling. I'm a borrower. A what? She swung him around by tightening the grip on his arm. A borrower, he repeated. There were tears in his eyes. He hoped they would not fall. So that's what you call it, he exclaimed, as he had done so long ago, it seemed now, that day with Arietti. That's the name, he said. The kind of people that borrowers. Borrowers, eh? Repeated Mrs. Driver wonderingly. She laughed. Well, they've done all the borrowing they're ever going to do in this house. She began to drag him toward the door. Tears spilled over his eyelids and ran down his cheeks. Don't hurt them, he begged. I'll move them, I promise. I know how. Mrs. Driver laughed again and pushed him roughly through the green baize door. They'll be moved out all right, she said. Don't worry. The rat catcher will know how. Crampfrill's old cat will know how. So will the sanitary inspector. The fire brigade, if need be. The police will know how, I shouldn't wonder. No need to worry about moving them once they've found the nest. She went on, dropping her voice to a vicious whisper, and they passed Aunt Sophie's door. And the rest is easy. She pushed him into the schoolroom and locked the door, and he heard the boards of the passage creak beneath her tread as, satisfied, she moved away. He crept into bed, and then, because he was cold, and cried his heart out under the blankets. Chapter 19. And that, said Mrs. May, laying down her crochet hook, is really the end. Kate stared at her. Oh, it can't be, she gasped. Oh, please, please. The last square, said Mrs. May, smoothing it out on her knee. The 150th. Now we can sew them together. Oh, said Kate, breathing again. The quilt. I thought you meant the story. It's the end of the story, too, said Mrs. May absently. Or the beginning. He never saw them again. And she began to sort out the squares. But, stammered Kate, you can't, it's not fair, she cried. It's cheating, it's... Tears sprang into her eyes. She threw her work down on the table, her crochet hook after it, and kicked the bag of wools which lay beside her on the carpet. Why, Kate, why? Mrs. May looked genuinely surprised. Something more must have happened, cried Kate angrily. What about the rat catcher, the policeman, and the... But something more did happen, said Mrs. May. A lot more happened. I'm going to tell you. Then why did you say it was the end? Because, said Mrs. May, she still looked surprised, he never saw them again. Then how can there be more? Because, said Mrs. May, there is more, a lot more. Kate glared at her. All right, she said, go on. Mrs. May looked back at her. Kate, she said after a moment, stories never really end. They can go on and on and on. It's just that sometimes at a certain point one stops telling them. But not at this kind of point, said Kate. Well, thread your needle, said Mrs. May, with grey wool this time, and we'll sew these squares together. I'll start at the top and you can start at the bottom. First a grey square, then an emerald, then pink, and so on. Then you didn't really mean it, said Kate irritably, trying to push the folded wool through the narrow eye of the needle. When you said he never saw them again. But I did mean it, said Mrs. May. I'm telling you just what happened. He had to leave suddenly at the end of the week because there was a boat for India and a family who could take him. And for 3 days before he left, they kept him locked up in those 2 rooms. For 3 days? Exclaimed Kate. Yes. Mrs. Driver, it seemed, told Aunt Sophie that he had a cold. She was determined, you see, to keep him out of the way until she got rid of the borrowers. And did she? Asked Kate. I mean, did they all come? The policeman, the rat catcher, and the sanitary inspector didn't come. At least not while my brother was there. And they didn't have the rat catcher from the town hall, but they had a local man. The police came, Mrs. May laughed. During those 3 days, Mrs. Driver used to give my brother a running commentary on what was going on below. She loved to grumble, and my brother, rendered harmless and shut away upstairs, became a kind of neutral. She used to bring his meals up, and on the first morning, she brought all the doll's furniture up on the breakfast tray and made my brother climb the shelves and put it back in the doll's house. It was then she told him about the policeman. Furious, he said she was. Why? Asked Kate. Because the policeman turned out to be Nellie Runker's son, Ernie, a boy Mrs. Driver had chased many a time for thieving, good-for-nothing driblet, stealing apples from the tree by the gate. She told my brother. Sitting down there, he is now in the kitchen, large as life with his notebook out, laughing fit to bust. 21, he says he's now, as cheeky as you make 'em. And was he? Asked Kate, round-eyed, a driblet of no good? Of course not, any more than my brother was. Ernie Runker was a fine, upstanding young man, and a credit to the police force. And he did not actually laugh at Mrs. Driver when she told him her story, but he gave her what Cranford spoke of afterwards as an old-fashioned look. When she described homily in bed, take more water with it, it seemed to say. More water with what? Asked Kate. A fine old pear Madeira, I suppose, said Mrs. May. And Great Aunt Sophie had the same suspicion. She was furious when she heard that Mrs. Driver had seen several little people when she herself, on a full decanter, had only risen, to 1 or at most 2. Cranford had to bring all the Madeira up from the cellar and stack the cases against the wall in a corner of Aunt Sophie's bedroom, where, as she said, she could keep an eye on it. Did they get a cat? Asked Kate. Yes, they did, but it wasn't much of a success either. It was Cranford's cat, a large yellow tom with white streaks on it. According to Mrs. Driver, it had only 2 ideas in its head, to get out of the house or into the larder. Talk of the borrowers, Mrs. Driver would say as she slammed down a fish pile for my brother's luncheon. The cat's a borrower. If ever there was one, borrowed a fish, that cat did. Good half bowl of egg sauce. The cat wasn't there long. First thing the rat catcher's terriers did was to chase it out of the house. There was a dreadful set to, my brother said. They chased it everywhere, upstairs, downstairs, in and out of all the rooms, barking their heads off. The last glimpse my brother had of the cat was streaking away through the spiny across the fields and the terriers after it. Did they catch it? No, Mrs. May laughed. It was still there when I went a year later, a little morose, but fit as a fiddle. Tell about when you went. Oh, I wasn't there long, said Mrs. May rather hastily, and after that the house was sold. My brother never went back. Kate stared at her suspiciously, pressing her needle against the center of her lower lip. So they never caught the little people, she said at last. Mrs. May's eyes flicked away. No, they never actually caught them, but, she hesitated, as far as my poor brother was concerned, what they did do seemed even worse. What did they do? Mrs. May laid down her work and stared for a moment thoughtfully at her idle hands. I hated the rat catcher, she said suddenly. Why? Did you know him? Everybody knew him. He had a walleye and his name was Rich William. He was also the pig killer, and, well, he did other things as well. He had a gun, a hatchet, a spade, a pickaxe, a contraption with bellows for smoking things out. I don't know what the smoke exactly. Poisonous fumes of some kind, which he made himself from herbs and chemicals. I only remember the smell of it. It clung round the barns wherever he'd been. You can imagine what my brother felt on that 3rd day, the day he was leaving, when suddenly he smelled that smell. He was all dressed and ready to go. The bags were packed and down in the hall. Mrs. Driver came and unlocked the door and took him down the passage to Aunt Sophie. He stood there, stiff and pale, in gloves and overcoat, beside the curtained bed. "Seasick already?" asked Aunt Sophie, peering down at him over the edge of the great mattress. "No," he said. "It's that smell." Aunt Sophie lifted a nose. She sniffed. "What smell is it, Mrs. Driver?" "It's the rat catcher, my lady," explained Mrs. Driver, reddening, "down in the kitchen." "What?" exclaimed Aunt Sophie. "Are you smoking them out?" And she began to laugh. Oh dear, she gasped. "But if you don't like them, Driver, the remedy's simple." "What is that, my lady?" asked Mrs. Driver coldly, but even her chins were red. Helpless with mirth, Aunt Sophie waved a ring hand toward her. Her eyes were screwed up and her shoulders shaking. "Keep the bottle corked," she managed at last, and motioned them weakly away. They heard her laughing still as they went on downstairs. "She don't believe in them," muttered Mrs. Driver, and she tightened her grip on my brother's arms. "More fool her! She'll change her tune like though when I take them up afterwards, laid out in sizes on a clean piece of newspaper." And she dragged him roughly across the hall. The clock had been moved, exposing the wainscot, and as my brother saw at once, the hall had been blocked and sealed. The front door was open as usual, and the sunshine streamed in. The bag stood there beside the fiber mat, cooking a little in the golden warmth. The fruit trees beyond the bank had shed their petals and were lit with tender green, transparent in the sunlight. "Plenty of time," said Mrs. Driver, glancing up the clock. "The cab's not due till 3:30. "The clock stopped," said my brother. Mrs. Driver turned. She was wearing her hat and her best black coat, ready to take him to the station. She looked strange and tight and chapel-going, not a bit like Driver. "So it has," she said. Her jaw dropped and her cheeks became heavy and pendulous. "It's moving it," she decided after a moment. "It'll be all right," she went on, "once we get it back. Mr. Firth comes Monday." And she dragged again with his arm above the elbow. "Where are we going?" he asked, holding back. "Along to the kitchen. We've got a good 10 minutes. Don't you want to see them get caught?" "No," he said. "No," and pulled away from her. Mrs. Driver stared at him, smiling a little. "I do," she said. "I'd like to see them close. He puffs this stuff in and they come running out. At least that's how it works in rats. But first he says you block up all the exits." And her eyes followed his to the hole below the wainscot. "How did they find it?" the boy asked. Puddied it looked, with a square of brown paper pasted on crooked. "Rich William found it. That's his job." "They could unstick that," said the boy after a moment. Mrs. Driver laughed. "Oh, no, they couldn't. Cemented, that is. A great block of it right inside, with a sheet of iron across the front, and the old stove in the outhouse. He and Crampfraw had to have the morning room floor up to get at it. All Tuesday they've been working up till tea time. They aren't going to have no more capers of that kind, not under the clock. Once you get that clock back, it can't be moved again in a hurry. Not if you want it to keep time, it can't. See, there's where it stood, where the floor was washed away like." And then my brother saw, for the first time and last time, the raised platform of unscrubbed stone. "Come on now," said Mrs. Driver, and took him by the arm. "We'll hear the cab from the kitchen." But the kitchen, as she dragged him past the baize door, seemed a babel of sound. No approaching cab could be heard there. What with the yelps and barks and stampings and excited voices, "Steady, steady, steady," Crampford was saying, on one loud note, and he held back the rat-catcher's terriers, which shrilled and panted on the leash. The policeman was there, Nellie Runker's son, Ernie. He had come out of interest and stood back from the others a little, in view of his calling, with a cup of tea in his hand and his helmet pushed off his forehead. But his face was pink and boyish with excitement, and he stirred the teaspoon round and round. "Seeing is believing," he said cheerfully to Mrs. Driver when he saw her come in at the door. The boy from the village was there with a ferret. It kept sort of pouring out of his pocket, my brother said,
and the boy kept pushing it back in. Rich William himself was crouched by the floor by the hole. He had lighted something beneath the pieces stacking, and the stench of smouldering eddied about the room. He was working the bellows now with infinite care, stooping over them, rapt and tense. My brother stood there as though in a dream. Perhaps it was a dream, he said to me later, much later, after we were all grown up. He gazed round the kitchen. He saw the sunlit fruit trees through the window and bough of cherry trees, which stood up on the bank. He saw the empty teacups on the table with spoons stuck in them, and one without a saucer he saw, propped against the wall, close beside the baize door. The rat catcher's belongings, a frayed coat patched with leather, a bundle of rabbit snares, 2 sacks, a spade, a gun and a pickaxe. "Stand by now," Rich William was saying. There was a rising note of excitement in his voice, but he did not turn his head. "Stand by, ready now to slip the dogs." Mrs. Driver let go my brother's arm and moved toward the hall. "Keep back," said the rat catcher, without turning. "Give us room." Mrs. Driver backed nervously toward the table. She put a chair beside it and half raised one knee, but lowered it again when she caught Ernie Runker's mocking glance. "All right, Ma," he said, cocking one eyebrow. "We'll give you up a leg when the time comes." And Mrs. Driver threw him a furious look. She snatched up the 3 cups from the table and stumped away with them, angrily into the scullery. Seeming-less much of something or other. My brother heard her mutter as she brushed past him, and at those words, suddenly, my brother came to life. He threw a quick glance about the kitchen. The men were absorbed, all eyes on the rat catcher, except those of the village boy who was getting out his ferret. Stealthily, my brother drew off his gloves and began to move backwards, slowly, toward the green baize door. As he moved, gently stuffing his gloves into his pocket, he kept his eyes on the group around the hall. He paused a moment beside the rat catcher's tools, stretched out a weary, groping hand. Its fingers closed at last on a wooden handle. Smooth as it was worn with wear, he glanced down quickly to make sure it was, yes, as he hoped, the pickaxe. He leaned back a little and pushed, almost imperceptibly, against the door with his shoulders. It opened sweetly in its silent way. Not one of the men had looked up. "Steady now," the rat catcher was saying, stooping closely over the bellows. "It takes a moment like to right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under the floor." My brother slid through the barely open door, and it sighed behind him, closing out the noise. He took a few steps on tiptoe down the dark kitchen passage, and then he ran. There was the hall again, steeped in sunshine, with his bags beside the door. He bumped against the clock and struck a note, trembling note, urgent and deep. He raised the pickaxe to the height of his shoulder and aimed sideways below at the hole below the wainscot. The paper tore, a few crumbles of plaster fell out, and the pickaxe rebounded sharply, jarring his hands. There was indeed iron behind the cement, something immovable. Again he struck, and again and again. The wainscot above the hole became split and cracked. The paper hung down in strips. But still the pickaxe bounced. It was no good. His hands, wet with sweat, were sliding and slipping out on the wood. He paused for a breath, looking out. He saw the cab. He saw it on the road, beyond the hedge at the far side of the orchard. Soon it would reach the russet apple tree beside the gate. Soon it would turn to the drive. He glanced up at the clock. It was ticking steadily, the result perhaps of his knock. The sound gave him comfort and steadied his thumping heart. Time, that's what he needed, a little bit of time. "It takes a moment, like," the rat catcher had said, "to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under the floor." Ventilation, that was the word, the saving word. Pickaxe in hand, my brother ran out the door. He stumbled once on the gravel path and nearly fell. The pickaxe handle came up and struck him a sharp blow on the temple. Already, when he reached for it, a thin filament of smoke was eddying out of the grating, and he thought, as he ran toward it, that there was a flicker of movement against the darkness between the bars. And that was where they would be, of course, to get air. But he did not stop to make sure. Already he heard behind him the crunch of wheels on gravel and the sound of the horse's hooves. He was not, as I've told you, a very strong little boy. He was only 9, not 10 as he boasted to Henriette. But with 2 great blows on the brickwork, he dislodged one end of the grating. It fell down sideways, slightly on a slant, hanging, it seemed, by one nail. Then he clambered up the bank and threw the pickaxe with all his might into the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He remembered thinking, as he stumbled back, sweaty and breathless, toward the cab, how that, too, the loss of the pickaxe, would cause its own kind of trouble later. Chapter 20. "But," exclaimed Kate, "didn't he see them come out?" "No, Mrs. Driver came along then in a flurry of annoyance because they were late for the train. She bustled him into the cab because she wanted to get back again, she said, as fast as she could to be in at the death. Driver was like that." Kate was silent a moment, looking down. "So that is the end," she said at last. "Yes," said Mrs. May, "or it could be, or the beginning." "But," Kate raised a worried face, "perhaps they didn't escape through the grating?" "Oh, they escaped all right," said Mrs. May lightly. "But how do you know?" "I just know," said Mrs. May. "But how did they get across the fields with the cows and things and the crows?" "They walked, I suppose. The Herring dearies did it. People can do anything when they have the mind to set to." "But poor Homily, she must have been so upset." "Yes, she was upset," said Mrs. May. "And how do you know they know the way?" "By the gas pipe," said Mrs. May. "There's a kind of a ridge all along through the spiny and across the fields. You see, when men dig a trench and put the pipe in it, all the earth they've dug up doesn't quite fit when they put it back. The ground looks different." "But poor Homily, she didn't have a tea or her furniture or her carpets or anything. Do you suppose they took anything?" "Oh, people always grab something," said Mrs. May shortly. "The oddest things sometimes, if you've read about shipwrecks." She spoke hurriedly, as though she were tired of the subject. "Do be careful, child, not grey next to pink. You have to unpick it." "But," went on Kate in a despairing voice as she picked up the scissors, "Homily would hate to arrive there all poor and destitute in front of Luppy." "Destitute?" said Mrs. May patiently. "And Luppy wasn't there, remember. Luppy never came back. And you know what Homily would do? Can't you see her? She'd be in her element. She would tie on her apron at once and cry, 'These silly poor men!' And she'd bustle and fuss and cook and clean and make them wipe their feet when they came in." "On what?" asked Kate. "On a piece of moss, of course, raised on the floor." "Were they all boys?" Kate asked after a moment. "Yes, harpsichords and clocks. Then they'll spoil Ariadne dreadfully." "What did they eat? Did they eat caterpillars, do you think?" "Oh, goodness, child, of course they didn't. They had a wonderful life, all that Ariadne ever dreamed of. They could live very well. Badger sets are almost like villages, full of passages and chambers and storehouses. They could gather hazelnuts and beechnuts and chestnuts. They could gather corn, which they had store and grind into flour, just as humans do it. It's all there for them. They didn't even have to plant it. They had honey. They could make elderflower tea and lime tea. They had hips and haws and blackberries and soles and wild strawberries. The boys could fish in the stream, and a minnow to them would be as big as a mackerel is to you. And they had birds' eggs, and the amount of them, for custards and cakes and omelettes. You see, they would know where to look for things. They had greens and salads, of course. Think of the salad made from those tender shoots of young hawthorn. Bread and cheese, we used to call it, with sorrel and dandelion and a sprinkling of thyme and wild garlic. Homily was a good cook, remember. She wasn't for nothing that the clocks had lived under the kitchen." "But the danger," cried Kate. "The weasels and the crows and the soats and all those things." "Yes," agreed Mrs. May. "Of course there was danger, but there's danger everywhere, but no more for them than for many human beings. At least they didn't have wars. And what about the early settlers of America? And those people who farm in the middle of a big game country in Africa and the edge of the jungles in India? They get to know the habits of the animals, Few animals kill for the sake of killing. Even rabbits know when a fox isn't hunting. They will run quite near him when he's full fed and lazing in the sun. There were boys, remember. They would learn to hunt for the pot and how to protect themselves. And don't suppose Arrietty and Homily would wander far afield. Arrietty would, said Kate. Yes, agreed Mrs. May, laughing. I suppose Arrietty might. So they'd have meat, said Kate. Oh, yes, sometimes, but borrowers are borrowers, not killers, I think, said Mrs. May. That if a stoat, they say, killed a partridge, they would borrow an egg. And if a fox killed a rabbit, they'd use his fur. Yes, for rugs and things. Supposing, said Kate, when they had a little roast, they skinned wholes and baked them? Would they taste like brown potatoes? Perhaps, said Mrs. May. But they couldn't cook in a badger's set. I suppose they cooked out of doors. How would they keep warm in the winter? Do you know what I think? Said Mrs. May. She laid down her work and leaned forward a little. I think that they didn't live in the badger's set at all. I think they used it, with its passages and storerooms, as a great honeycomb of an entrance hall. None but they would know the secret way through the tunnels which led at last to their home. Borrowers love those passages, and they love gates, and they love to live a long way from their own front doors. Where would they live then? I was wondering, said Mrs. May, about the gas pipe. Oh, yes, cried Kate. I see what you mean. Soil's all soft and sandy up there. I think they'd go right to the badger set and dig out a circular chamber, level with the gas pipe. And off this chamber, all around it, there'd be little rooms like cabins. And I think, said Mrs. May, that they'd bore 3 little pinholes in the gas pipe. One would be so tiny that you could hardly see it, and that one would always be alight. The other 2 would have stoppers in them, which they would use to light the gas, and they would pull out. They would light the bigger ones from the small burner, and that's where they'd cook, and that's what would give them light. But would they be so clever? But they were clever, Mrs. May assured her. Very clever, much too clever to live near a gas pipe and not use it. They're borrowers, remember? But they'd want a little air hole. Oh, said Mrs. May quickly. They did have one. How do you know? Asked Kate. Because once when I was up there, I smelled hot pot. Oh, cried Kate excitedly. She twisted round and knelt up on the hassock. Did you go up there? So that's how you know. You saw them too. No, said Mrs. May, drawing a little in her chair. I never saw them, never. But you went up there. You know something. I can see you know. Yes, I went up there. Mrs. May stared back into Kate's eager face. Hesitant, she seemed, almost a little guilty. Well, she conceded at last, I'll tell you. But what it's worth, when I went to stay in the house, it was just before Aunt Sophie went into the nursing home. I knew the place was going to be sold, so Again, Mrs. May hesitated, almost shyly. Well, I took all the furniture out to the doll's house and put it in a pillowcase and took it up there. I brought things out, too, in my pocket money. Tea and coffee beans and salt and pepper and cloves and great packet of lump sugar. And I took a whole lot of little pieces of silk which were over for making the patchwork quilt. And I took them some fish bones for needles. And I took the tiny thimble I had got at Christmas pudding and a whole collection of scraps and crackers, things I got in the chocolate box. But you never saw them. No, I never saw them. I sat for hours against the bank below the hawthorn ridge. It was a lovely bank, twined in twisted hawthorn roots and riddled with sandy holes, and there were wood violets and primroses and early campion. From the top of the bank you could see for miles across the fields. You could see the woods and the valleys and the twisting lanes. You could see the chimneys of the house. Perhaps it was the wrong place. I don't think so. Sitting there in the grass, half dreaming and watching beetles and ants, I found an oak apple. It was smooth and polished and dry, and there was a hole bored into one spot and a slice off the top. A teapot! Exclaimed Kate. I think so. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find the quill spout. I called then down on the halls, as my brother had done, but no one answered. The next day, when I went up there, the pillowcase had gone. And everything in it? Yes, everything. I searched the ground for yards all around in case there might be a scrap of silk or coffee bean, but there was nothing. Of course, somebody passing might have just picked it up and carried it away. That was the day, Mrs. May said, smiling, that I smelled hot pot. And which was the day, asked Kate, that you found Ariette's diary? Mrs. May laid down her work. Kate, she began in a startled voice, and then uncertainly she smiled. What makes you say that? Her cheeks had become quite pink. I guessed, said Kate. I knew there was something you wouldn't tell me, like reading somebody else's diary. It wasn't the diary, said Mrs. May hastily, but her cheeks became even pinker. It was a book called Memoranda, and the book with blank pages. That's where she'd written it. And it wasn't on the day I found it, but 3 weeks later, the day before I left. Kate sat silent, staring at Mrs. May. After a while, she drew a long breath. Then that proves it, she said finally. Underground chamber and all. Not quite, said Mrs. May. Why not? Asked Kate. Ariette used to make her E's like little half moons with a stroke in the middle. Well, said Kate. Mrs. May laughed and took up her work again. My brother did that too. The end. Well, that is the end of our book. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. It's such a fun little story. We do have a couple discussion questions that I'd like to talk about with you guys before we wrap up. Why does the family of borrowers have to move immediately? What happened? Well, Mrs. Driver, the housekeeper, found them out, and she saw them scurrying away. She knew it wasn't just mice. What do you feel the boy was thinking when Mrs. Driver locked him in his room? I mean, lots of things. He was definitely upset and angry. He knew it was partially his fault that they got found and that they're going to have to go away. And he was trying to help save them, right? And now he's helpless. He can't do anything because he's locked in that room. Mrs. Driver sent a cat after the borrowers. What happened to this cat? Did it find the borrowers? It got chased away by the rat catcher's dogs. They're called terriers, little dogs, and they chased the cat instead of looking for anything because, well, there weren't rats in the house, right? It was borrowers. What did the boy do in the end that probably saved the borrowers' lives? Well, he was trying to break the hole that was under the clock, right? Their gate. But what did he end up breaking instead? It was a grate to the outside, okay? So a grate is like kind of a mesh thing that probably let out some steam of heat from the house. And he broke it so that they could escape that way. He probably saved their lives that way. Mrs. May has her own reason for believing in the borrowers. What were they? She, first off, believed her brother. Her brother told her this story many times. Also, she went out and left things for them. So when that house was going to be sold, she took all of the doll furniture that her brother had put out for them in the first place out to the badger hole or somewhere near there, and it was gone. And the tea and lots of other things that she got. One other thing, she found Ariette's kind of diary or thing that she wrote in a lot. And what was something that she found that was kind of similar? The way Ariette drew an E is the exact same way her brother did too. I thought that was a really fun little thing that they put in at the end. So Mrs. May believes this story was very true. And I think her little friend Kate might believe it as well.
Well, that is The Borrowers. I hope you have enjoyed this story as much as I have, and we will see you back here with another chapter book read along starting next week.